So you know that like sick, anxious feeling you get while you're waiting for a really important text message? You know, where you're just checking your phone over and over and over, waiting for that reply. Well, this story starts with me sitting in the middle of the wilderness as the sun's going down while I was in the middle of a weeks-long hike, doing just that, refreshing my phone, you know, just waiting for this reply, super, super anxious to see what the text message said, because I felt like this text message could mean the difference between my life or my death. And in order for you to understand why this text message was so important to me, I need to tell you what might be the most insane story that I've ever covered on this channel. And so with that said, let's take a virtual trip together right now to a very infamous place named Dannemora, New York. Now, this trip is totally free, but you must hit that subscribe button to cover your admission. Our goal for 2025 is to hit 1 million subscribers before the end of the year, which is a very lofty goal, to be honest. And so any help that you can give us by hitting that subscribe button would be amazing, especially if you are a repeat viewer. Okay, I'm willing to bet that unless you already know this story, almost none of you have ever heard of the town Dannemora, New York. I'm sure you've heard of New York State, of course. You know Syracuse, New York City, Buffalo, Rochester, Albany, the capital. But you don't know Dannemora, and that's because Dannemora is in what I like to call the forgotten part of New York State. Because believe it or not, there's a lot more to the state than just New York City and those other slightly smaller cities. There's actually a whole part of the state from the Adirondack Mountains north, even north of the mountains up near Potsdam, where I went to school. There's a whole nother part of the state that doesn't have that much going on and really never gets talked about. And there, deep in the heart of the Adirondack Mountains, is where the town of Dannemora is. And what makes Dannemora so significant is that there's a prison right smack in the center of this town. There's lots of towns out there that have prisons in them, but I've never seen a town where the prison walls literally run right next to the main street of the town. Like just across from this giant wall are houses and businesses. I mean, it's such a jarring image to look at. Now, this prison is called the Clinton Correctional Facility, but the truth is that it has a lot of other nicknames, like just Dannemora, or even more infamously, Little Siberia. This is because of how remote the prison is, how far north it is, how cold and crazy the weather gets there, and due to the fact that this prison is a maximum security prison. It's actually the largest maximum security prison in the entire state of New York. It was built in 1877, and it's housed a number of famous inmates over the years, like Tupac, for instance, and a bunch of other ones. It truly is the kind of prison that even the toughest and most dangerous criminals will do anything to avoid being sent to. Oh, and by 2015, there were 2 specific inmates who actually fit that exact profile at this prison. They were tough and they were dangerous. They were both 2 brutal killers. And, well, they were in the process of devising a plan to break the hell out of Dannemora Prison for good. And this wasn't just some outlandish, like insane, obviously not going to happen kind of plan. It was a crazy plan, don't get me wrong, but it was actually so crazy that their plan, well, it just might work. But before I tell you about their plan, I need to introduce these 2 men to you in the first place. And the first man's name was Richard Matt, and the second man's name was David Sweat. And these 2 dudes, well, their stories are quite dark. And so before we get there, I do want to lighten things up for a moment, especially when it comes to David Sweat. Oh, and speaking of sweat, if you or a loved one sweats a lot like I do, then, well, you need to hear about Drink Element, who is the sponsor of this video. Replacing your electrolytes is super important. Drink Element is the best way to do this. I mean, let's be honest, if you don't replace your electrolytes after a workout or just working on the yard or doing anything that makes you sweat, if you don't replace those electrolytes, you're gonna feel fatigued, you're gonna get muscle cramps. It's just not good, it's not healthy. And what you could do is just go into Walmart or whatever grocery store you have, Safeway, HEB, and you could just get the stuff they have in stock there. But the truth is you probably don't want to, because those other electrolyte drink mixes are going to be full of sugar and other BS, which Drink Element is not. And that's the first reason why they are the best electrolyte drink mix in the game. And the second reason is because they have amazing flavors. Right now, they literally have this thing called the chocolate medley. It's electrolytes that you can add to various hot drinks, you know, kind of cold weather, wintry drinks, so that you can hydrate, replace your electrolytes, and kind of be in the winter spirit at the same time. And of course, they also have more traditional flavors like citrus salt or grapefruit salt. Their flavors are so amazing. You really want to try as many of them as you can. And actually, that's quite convenient, because if you go to drinkelement.com/KyleHatesHiking, that's drinklmnt.com/KyleHatesHiking, you make an order on their website, you are going to get a sample pack of 8 additional flavors thrown in with your order for no extra cost. You got to do it through my link. It'll be at the top of the description. Or one more time, drinklmnt.com/KyleHatesHiking. Go get your sample pack. And now I got to tell you about David Sweat and Richard Matt. So both these dudes had quite the rap sheet. I mean, I'm not going to sugarcoat it here. Richard Matt was serving 25 years to life for torturing and then murdering his former boss, whose name was William Rickerson. That occurred in the year 1997, but it wasn't the only time that Richard Matt had killed, by the way. He was actually convicted of a murder in Mexico a few years later, and he served nearly 10 years in prison there before finally being extradited to New York State in order to face trial for the 1997 murder. And one thing that is interesting to note about Richard Matt's time in prison over the years is that he had a reputation for escape attempts. He had multiple escape attempts, including when he was on trial in 2008. He even had a successful one back in 1986, where he escaped for like 5 days before he was recaptured. You know, this is the kind of inmate that you want to keep an eye on at pretty much all times. You definitely don't want him, I don't know, like on the honor block at your prison, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Now to move on to this David Sweat character. So in the early 2000s, David Sweat and 2 other accomplices shot and then ran over a police officer who had kind of interrupted them in the middle of a burglary. And due to this just heinous crime, David Sweat was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. And of course, the paths of these 2 brutal killers would eventually cross at the Clinton Correctional Facility, where, as I just alluded to a second ago, they were both housed on the honor block, despite their heinous crimes and despite Richard Matt's history of escapes and escape attempts. One thing that is kind of interesting about these 2 guys is that despite the fact that they're these like brutal, tough killers or whatever, when they first met each other, they actually bonded over painting, like artwork. And, you know, just like, I don't know. I find this kind of funny, to be honest. I guess if you're in prison for life, you don't have much else to do, but like these 2 just like super tough, bad dudes are both just like going over paintings together, and Matt was kind of teaching Sweat how to paint. But if you look at their paintings, it's actually decent work, which is actually something that's going to come into play very shortly here. In addition to bonding over painting, Matt and Sweat both worked and sat together in one of the prison's tailor shops. And it's in this tailor shop that Richard Matt and David Sweat met a woman, a worker, a supervisor, not another inmate, obviously. They met a woman named Joyce Mitchell. Now, Joyce Mitchell was a local to the Dannemora area, and she started working at the Clinton Correctional Facility in 2008, and she eventually became the supervisor in tailor shop number 1, where both Matt and Sweat worked. Oh, and by the way, working in this tailor shop as an inmate was a very big deal because, first of all, it's just a better way to pass the time. But more importantly than that, it actually gave the inmates a little bit more freedom than they would have otherwise had. Not a ton of freedom. Obviously, there's still inmates in a maximum security prison in the middle of nowhere, New York, but still a little more freedom nonetheless. And when you're locked up for life like that, I can only imagine that every little bit of freedom that you're granted probably means a lot. They're paid a little bit more money, which allows them to spend a little bit more money on food and other items, and that's just even more freedom that they're granted. It's a really big deal. And another way that Richard Matt and David Sweat were able to get a little bit more freedom for themselves was by developing a relationship with Joyce Mitchell. A relationship that was probably a little bit too close. In fact, by this point, Mitchell had kind of built up a reputation amongst the inmates and the other workers at the prison as being someone who got too close to the inmates. And when she met David Sweat and Richard Matt, that was ramped up to a whole new level. It very quickly became apparent to other inmates that Joyce Mitchell had a crush on David Sweat. She had a crush on this cop killer dude locked up for life. I don't know how that happened, probably loneliness and other relationship issues in her personal life, but regardless of how it happened, it most certainly did happen, to the point where inmates were even writing letters to the prison higher-ups trying to call out this inappropriate relationship that Mitchell had with Sweat and, to a lesser degree, Matt. She was seen flirting with David Sweat in the tailor shop all of the time. She was putting her arm around him, laughing with him, clearly favoriting him. And there was even some rumors, we'll say, that, well, every now and again, Joyce Mitchell would take David Sweat into the back room to go grab something, and she would end up grabbing something else, if you know what I mean. Yeah, there was rumors that there was a sexual relationship between Joyce Mitchell and David Sweat. This is something that she denied, but nonetheless, there were a lot of inmates who thought this was happening. This went on for some time, but eventually, well, there was enough complaints, and they were just so brazen about their relationship, whatever you want to call it, that David Sweat was removed from Tailor Shop 1. And again, this is a big deal for him. Even Joyce Mitchell aside, all that weird stuff, just the fact that he's no longer in the tailor shop is a massive deal, because that's a lot of freedom that was just taken away from him. He's already in prison for his entire life for something that he alleges he didn't do, by the way. And now he doesn't even have the freedom to spend a few extra dollars on better food than the prison food that they're usually given. Now he doesn't have the freedom to see the people that he had developed friendships with in the tailor shop, or the freedom to go in the back room with Joyce Mitchell, allegedly. The fact that he was removed from this tailor shop was a huge deal for David Sweat, and it was also a huge deal for Joyce Mitchell. Apparently, she was extremely enraged when the prison decided to remove Sweat, even to the point where inmates saw her crying over the matter. At one point, Joyce Mitchell even allegedly told Richard Matt, quote, "Hurry up and get Dave back here. I'm horny as f." Now, David Sweat had been fantasizing about breaking out of prison basically since the day he was first locked up, but for most of that time, it was just a fantasy. After being removed from the tailor shop, however, that was kind of like the straw that broke the camel's back. He was so fed up, so sick of his life behind bars, and then this other little thing happens, and finally he's just like, you know what? I gotta figure out a way to get out of here. And don't get me wrong, I'm sure there's a lot of inmates out there that try to escape, or say they're gonna escape, and they don't even come close because it's extremely difficult, obviously. And also because a lot of these inmates aren't really the sharpest people out there. I'm just gonna say it, no offense if you're currently serving life in jail and you're watching this, but I'm saying this because David Sweat was not one of these inmates. David Sweat was actually, as much as I hate to give him credit, a very smart dude. And the fact that he had established this relationship with Joyce Mitchell, the fact that he had this friendship with Richard Matt, who's gonna come into play in a second here, I don't know, there was just a lot of different factors that made David Sweat legitimately think that he could escape from this maximum security prison. This wasn't just a fantasy. This wasn't just a pipe dream, although pipes are going to come in shortly here. This was something that could actually happen. And thus, in January of 2015, David Sweat and Richard Matt started legitimately making plans to bust out of Clinton Correctional Facility for good. When David Sweat was kicked out of the tailor shop, this left a vacuum that Richard Matt quickly filled. He kind of swooped in and started to get close to Joyce Mitchell just as David Sweat had, and Richard Matt kind of became the next person that Joyce Mitchell started to build this inappropriate relationship with. Both Sweat and Matt were really, really good at manipulating, and again, Joyce Mitchell was just in a place in her life where she was unfortunately just ripe to be a victim of manipulation. So these two inmates come together and they start to formulate this plan. And at first it's very broad, you know. They decide that once they get out, they need to flee the country as soon as possible. It's almost as if crossing that international border out of the United States would be like some symbol of finally reaching freedom. Like that line is the freedom that they've been seeking. Of course, in reality, it's a little more complicated, but thinking about it from their perspective, you know, they need to just focus on reaching that border before they focus on anything else. And so once they have that part of the plan, they need to figure out how they're going to actually escape from the prison. And this is where Joyce Mitchell comes back in. If they're going to bust out of the prison, they're going to need some tools to help them do that. And at this point, Joyce Mitchell was so close to Richard Matt and David Sweat that she was 100% down to start sneaking in tools to help them with their escape. Richard Matt was quoted saying, she, referring to Joyce Mitchell, she's nuts. She'll bring us whatever we want. Just tell me what you need and I'll get her to bring it in. And so this essentially became the plan for the two men. David Sweat would do the hard work, the route finding, the cutting, everything needed to actually break out of the prison. And Richard Matt, since he was still working in the tailor shop with Joyce Mitchell, well, he would kind of relay information between her and David Sweat, and he would be the one that would kind of manipulate her in order to get tools and other supplies that the prisoners needed. David Sweat's initial plan was to scale the prison wall somehow, but he quickly realized that plan wasn't going to work because, well, his partner in crime, Richard Matt, was very out of shape, to put it mildly. David Sweat was very fit, but Richard Matt was not, and Sweat knew that he wasn't going to be able to scale this wall. And so they abandoned that idea, and then Matt had another idea. Just on the other side of the walls for each prison cell were these catwalks that kind of just led down into the bowels of the prison where all the pipes were. This prison was constructed in the late 1800s, so it's very old. There's just a maze of tunnels and pipes and just like construction stuff right behind the walls of their cells. And both of these men had actually been behind their cells before on the catwalks, which they were not supposed to be doing, but some of the guards had been lackadaisical with them and allowed them to go back there to do some electrical work on their cells and other things like that. And so the men knew that if they could get through their cell walls, they could probably find a way out of the prison. They knew it wouldn't be easy, but they felt like it would be possible. And so it didn't take long before Joyce Mitchell was smuggling in hacksaws and other tools through Richard Matt, eventually arriving to David Sweat. The prison workers were supposed to be searched as they came to work every day, but Clinton Correctional Facility was not enforcing this at the time, and Joyce Mitchell used it to her advantage. In addition to that, there was actually another prison worker. This gentleman was an actual guard who Richard Matt and David Sweat had kind of manipulated to help them. His name was Gene Palmer, and I do want to be clear that Gene Palmer did not know about the men's plan to break out of the prison. Joyce Mitchell certainly did. Palmer did not. However, he still was not following prison protocols, and he was helping out Richard Matt in particular by giving him warnings about upcoming cell searches and by giving him escorts to and from the tailor shop without going through metal detectors or other searches, which allowed Richard Matt to smuggle even more tools over to David Sweat. And by the way, remember when I was talking about painting a few minutes ago? Well, the reason that Gene Palmer was doing Richard Matt these favors was because Richard Matt, this is crazy, Richard Matt was making paintings for Gene Palmer and then giving them to him in exchange for these favors. He made him like 10 plus paintings, pictures of his family and other things. Gene Palmer was like smuggling in paint supplies for Richard Matt so that he could paint it for him. It was super strange. Matt and Joyce were even getting bold enough to hide blades and other tools inside huge chunks of frozen ground beef, and then giving those to Gene Palmer, who did not know the tools were inside, and then telling him to smuggle the ground beef back to Richard Matt's cell. And I mean, just insane. This sounds like something that is just made up by Hollywood or whatever, but this is all 100% true. And it gets even crazier, so buckle up. First of all, it didn't take long before Richard Matt and Joyce Mitchell also started to develop a sexual relationship, and this is one that Joyce Mitchell actually did admit to. And as if it couldn't get any crazier, well, eventually Joyce Mitchell decided that she was going to join Richard Matt and David Sweat after they escaped and drive them to Mexico and then start a new life with them. And so at the beginning of 2015, both men start cutting through the walls of their prison cells with these tools that had been smuggled in. And every single evening from 6:30 p.m. to 8 p.m. during dinner and recreation time, the two men would be up there cutting through their walls. One person would stand guard as the other person cut, and then they would trade off every 15 minutes or so. And it really didn't take long for them to finish their holes in their cell walls. David Sweat finished in about 3 weeks, and Matt finished in about 4. And so now that they have these giant holes in their cells, they have to hide them somehow, of course. David Sweat went to great lengths to kind of mask the hole that he had cut in his wall. He got some tape, and he would like tape over the lines of the hole, the cut lines, and then he actually had paint that was matching to the wall color of his cell, because the officers would give that to inmates sometimes so they could touch up the paint jobs in their cell, which is crazy to me, but he had this paint, and so he would tape over the cut lines, paint them over, and then you couldn't even tell that he had cut this hole behind his bed in the wall. However, despite David Sweat's effort to cover his hole up, he was quite worried about his friend Richard Matt's hole. He saw it a couple times, and he was like, dude, you're not hiding this hole very well. There's an entire theme throughout this story of David Sweat not really trusting Richard Matt, or being worried that Matt was going to kind of blow the whole plan. And Matt's cell was even searched one day, according to prison records, but they didn't find the hole. And this is probably because the search never actually happened and was likely forged in the records. And so the holes in the two men's cell walls were never found. And now it was time for David Sweat to search for a potential route out of the prison. So from the very first night that David Sweat finished the hole in his cell wall, he would go out after 11 p.m. and start searching for a route out of the prison. He's kind of just exploring around, wandering around on the catwalks in the back of the prison. For David Sweat, this was a very significant thing, not only because it was another step towards breaking out, but because being out of his cell, being in a place he wasn't supposed to be, kind of on his own terms like this, was this taste of freedom that was just so amazing for him. He was quoted saying, "It felt good because you kind of felt free. You know, you weren't caged up in the cell no more. Nobody knew where you were. It was something new. It was doing something that I could actually use my mind for, that I could apply myself to." At one point, while David Sweat was exploring the catwalk, he was almost hit by a cigarette that a guard, floors above him, had kind of just discarded. It was still a lit cigarette, and it nearly struck David Sweat on the top of his head. But of course, he didn't care as long as he didn't get caught. And while he was exploring around trying to find a way out of the prison, he found even more tools that he could use in his escape. These were tools that had been just left there by workers, probably years ago. This prison is so old again. And they never imagined that any inmates would be in this part of the prison. The only people that really should have been there were workers and guards for the most part. And so people just left tools around, and David Sweat found them and he used them to his advantage. He worked for months to try and find a way out of the prison. Every single night, 11 p.m. was when the last count would be before the morning, and so right after the guards passed his cell, he would slip down underneath his bed, he would pull out the part of the wall that he had cut, and then he would get into the catwalk and he would just go. And eventually he came across a major obstacle, a literal and figural wall blocking his progress. This wall was made of bricks, and so after searching, trying to find another way around this wall, David Sweat realized that his only option was to bust through this brick wall. And so how is an inmate supposed to break through a giant wall like this? Well, with a lot of hard work, a lot of patience, and some stolen tools. That's how. David Sweat worked night after night, busting the bricks out of this wall. But he wasn't just breaking down the wall. Every single night, once he was done working and he needed to get back to his cell before the morning head count, he would replace each brick that he had busted out so that if someone did come across the wall, they wouldn't notice that anything was out of place, which I think is absolutely incredible. It's just another example of how just crazy this story is. The attention to detail that this guy had when it came to his ambitious plan. He does this for months, and eventually he's able to get through the wall. And so now every single night he's going down there, he's getting through this brick wall, and he's trying to find the actual wall of the prison, that wall that you can see, the other side of, obviously, in the photos of downtown Dannemora, New York. It took David Sweat many months to get there, but eventually, towards the end of the spring, he found the wall. He literally walked and broke his way from his cell all the way to the final wall of the prison. On the other side of that wall, folks, was freedom. All he had to do was get through it. And this was not going to be easy. David Sweat passed on the news that he had reached the final wall to Richard Matt, who then passed on the news to Joyce Mitchell. They knew at this point that they were extremely close to breaking out, and so they started to make their final plans for when the men actually broke out, the things that were going to happen next. And, well, it's quite incredible. The two men convinced Joyce Mitchell of this plan. Step one, meet them outside of the prison walls in her vehicle so she could pick them up. Step two, drive to Joyce Mitchell's house so that the two men could kill her husband, who also worked at the prison, by the way. Step three was then to hightail it out of northern New York all the way down to the country of Mexico, once again, reaching that international border, that line that marked freedom for them, and then start a new life. The part that the two men didn't tell Joyce Mitchell, and to be honest, it's not clear even to this day, is what they planned to do with her once they did reach Mexico. It's been speculated that they probably were going to kill her too at that point, having gotten everything they needed out of her. We don't know for sure if that was going to happen, but that was their rough plan. The only thing left at this point was to actually get through that final wall. And David Sweat realized that he actually would be able to do this relatively quickly. This time he wasn't going to just bust through the wall. I mean, this wall was much bigger, much thicker. That wouldn't have been possible. However, there was a steam pipe that ran through the wall. And David Sweat realized that he could actually cut into the steam pipe and then get in the pipe, travel through it until he reached the other side of the wall, and then cut an exit hole and then pop out. And so this is what he did. It took about 2 weeks for him to cut the first hole into the steam pipe. And then he got inside the pipe, which is a total nightmare if you're claustrophobic. Can you imagine this? Like, you're in a steam pipe cramped in there. It was barely big enough for him. He gets in there and then he inches his way through the pipe, underneath the wall. And he has to kind of guess and calculate where to cut the exit hole, because if he cuts it too soon, he's still going to be on the inside of the wall or maybe there'll be some other obstacle there. Oh, and another thing, by the way, when you're cramped inside of a pipe like this, it was getting extremely hot and stuffy. And so David Sweat literally created a ventilation system for himself while he was working on the exit hole of the pipe. He took a fan and some plastic bags and kind of just like sealed them behind him in the entrance hole so that it was blowing fresh air into the pipe so he wasn't just like suffocating in there. He was going all out, folks. And eventually he was able to finish that exit hole. He finishes cutting and he punches through on June 5th, 2015. And as soon as he does this, he starts looking for a manhole because he knows once he finds a manhole, it's going to pop him out outside the prison. And he finds one, but he's kind of like looking through a little bit and he notices it's near this facility. There's like workers around and stuff, or he fears there might be. And so he's like, that's not really a good one. And so he backtracks a little bit and he eventually finds this manhole right here. You're looking at this on Google Street View right now. And, you know, it's kind of a crazy scene with the prison in the background there, but this manhole right here is so significant, such a famous spot at this point, even though it doesn't really look like it, because this is the manhole that on the night of June 5th, David Sweat popped open and poked his head out of, realizing for the first time that he had literally broken his way out of prison. This pipe dream, this thing he had been working towards since January, well, he had succeeded. And the crazy thing is he literally could have just ran off in that moment. He was out. He could have done it. But him and Richard Matt had made a plan. There's no way that David Sweat could have made it that far without Richard Matt because he was the one kind of manipulating Joyce Mitchell. And so David Sweat, in a weird way, did like the honorable thing. And instead of busting out in that moment and just saying screw it and running, he decided to wait. And so he was literally free at that moment. And he goes back into the prison, climbs all the way back up to his cell, and he tells Richard Matt, tomorrow is the night. We're doing it. And so the very next night, this is June 6th, 2015, the 11 p.m. head count happens. And then immediately after, the two men start to make their preparations. Richard Matt was even getting a little cocky with it. He left a few notes for the guards and everybody else to find when they inevitably realized the two prisoners were missing. He was basically taunting them. He left a note that read, quote, "You left me no choice but to grow old and die in here. I had to do something." He also left one of his paintings with a note that said, "Time to go, kid." And the two of them also left this very strange racist note on the steam pipe. It just read, "Have a nice day." And apparently this note had been given to the men like a few days before they broke out, and it didn't really have any, they weren't really trying to send any like grand message with it. They just thought it was kind of funny and they left it there. Either way, it was very strange. And they also, in classic, you know, Prison Break style, the two men left dummies in their beds, in the beds of their cell, so that if the guards did come by, if they weren't paying very close attention, it would kind of look like they were still in their beds. I mean, you literally can't make this stuff up, folks. It's absolutely insane. And another thing you can't make up is that Richard Matt had a hell of a time getting through the steam pipe. Again, Richard Matt wasn't exactly in the best shape. He had lost some weight leading up to this escape, mostly at David Sweat's insistence because he knew how tight that steam pipe was, and he knew Richard Matt was a little bit of a big boy. He might not fit. And turns out Richard Matt did fit, but just barely. He was so cramped in there and so claustrophobic and freaking out that David Sweat literally had to pull him through with a bed sheet. Oh, and by the way, during this process, Matt's pants actually fell down, to which David Sweat said, quote, "Oh, Matt, I didn't know you cared." But despite this setback, you could say, the two men were successful. They reached the manhole, they popped out just before midnight, and all they had to do now was wait for Joyce Mitchell with their getaway car. Remember, there's like houses and stuff around this manhole. It's just like a little neighborhood, you know, right outside the prison. And after they came out of the manhole, a car drove by, which obviously freaked the men out, particularly freaked out Richard Matt because he went running into someone's yard to try to hide. But then it turns out that the car turned into that very same property. And so right from the beginning, literally the moment after they emerged, their entire plot was almost foiled. However, David Sweat was quick thinking, and he told the person that pulled into this house, who yelled at them and was like, "What are you guys doing?" David Sweat told them that they were just looking for another house. They were on the wrong street. They were confused. He apologized, and then the two men kind of just scurried away. So they dodged that bullet, but shortly after this happened, they quickly realized that a major part of their plan was screwed, to put it mildly. Joyce Mitchell, she bailed. She didn't show up. She didn't follow through with the plans that she had been working towards for months with these two inmates. She actually, at this time, was in the hospital. She had checked herself into the hospital. She hadn't told anyone what was going on, but she was having a panic attack. And instead of picking the men up, she went to the hospital. And so they're standing around waiting for her, not realizing that she's literally hooked up to an IV or something somewhere else. She doesn't show up, and the men waited for a little bit before they eventually realized it wasn't going to happen. And so in that moment, just like that, now, instead of heading towards Mexico as that line of freedom, they had to change their plan, and they had to change the line a lot further north. So now, all of a sudden, Canada is the goal. Canada is that international line that marks their freedom. Again, it's a little more complicated than that. Of course, the Canadian officials are going to be looking for them too, but that's all they're thinking about. We got to make it to Canada now. We have no choice. And so the two men just head off into the woods and slowly start to make their way north towards the land of hockey and poutine. The very next morning, at the 5:30 a.m. head count, the guards discover that Richard Matt and David Sweat are nowhere to be found. The holes in their cell walls are quickly found, and it didn't take long at all for the prison officials to realize what had happened, to even follow the exact route that the men took out. They found their notes taunting them, and within just a few hours, New York Governor Andrew Cuomo was standing in the prisoners' cells, surveying what had happened, trying to get to the bottom of this. Again, this is a maximum security prison. This kind of thing is not supposed to happen. These are two convicted killers, just brutal, brutal people. The fact that they escaped from a prison like this was unbelievable. And so it was just a massive deal. There's cameras everywhere covering this. It's all over national news. And very quickly, sightings of the two men who are now on the run started to just pour in from all over the area. Not even just the area, actually. All over the state, even all over the country. A massive manhunt is started, but within a few days, they still had zero clues. They still had no idea where the men were. And that's because the area that this prison is in, once again, it's extremely remote. This is the Adirondack Mountains. It's rural, it's forested, it's rugged. It's not an easy area to search. There's a lot of just wilderness that the men could be hiding in. There's tons of small little cabins and hunting camps. And actually, if it wasn't for those cabins, the men probably would have died or been found very quickly. Their plan essentially was to move at night and search for various either abandoned or unoccupied cabins. And they actually found a number of them. And inside the cabins, Matt and Sweat found food, water, supplies. They also found a shotgun, and they found alcohol, which was something that Richard Matt quickly started to hit quite hard. Again, he's been locked up for years, since the late 90s, and so he hasn't had a drink since then, and all of a sudden he's got just, what seems like an endless supply of liquor in front of him. He's stealing liquor and beer from these cabins. And so he's like, screw it. Why not? I'm going to go for it. I'm just going to start getting drunk. I'm going to let loose. I'm finally free. And, you can kind of sympathize with that mindset, but it's important to know that David Sweat was the exact opposite. He didn't touch the alcohol at all, because for David Sweat, he wasn't free yet. He had a taste of freedom at this point, but he wasn't free. He needed to reach that Canadian border, and he needed to settle in somewhere so he could just start his life over. And so he was very aware that he was on the run. This was not the time to party and let loose. This was the time to evade capture. And as the days dragged on, he starts to realize that the thing he had been suspecting deep down right from the very beginning was true, which was that Richard Matt, he was just slowing him down. Again, he needed Matt in order to actually break out of the prison, but at this point, he didn't really need him anymore. Matt was obviously not in as good a shape as Sweat. He couldn't move as quick, and he was getting drunk now. He had a shotgun. And so by June 23rd, David Sweat decides that he's just going to ditch Matt altogether. He's done with it. And so what he does is, while they're moving through the woods, all of a sudden he's like, look, there's cops over there. He kind of like gets frantic and spooks Matt, and then he just runs off. And he's like, we got to run. And so the two men start running, and of course David Sweat is a lot faster, and he just straight up ditches Matt. He just runs away. He lied to him. He fooled him. And he felt a little bit bad about this, but at the same time, he had literally broken this dude out of prison. Like, Matt wouldn't have been able to get out without Sweat. And so he's like, you know what? I've done this guy enough favors. He's going to lead to me getting captured if I don't ditch him. And so he did it. And it didn't take long after this for Richard Matt to finally meet his end. Flash forward to June 26th, 2015. By this point, the authorities are hot on the tail of the two suspects. Some of the cabins that they had broken into had been discovered, vandalized. They had even done some DNA testing and confirmed that the two inmates had been in some of these cabins. And so they were getting very, very close to catching them. And so on June 26th, investigators were searching a cabin right off of Route 30, a little bit south of Malone, New York, which is a town I know very well. I've driven through there 1,000 times. They're searching this cabin, and then all of a sudden, they hear a gunshot. And it turns out that a camper had been driving down Route 30. They had also heard the gunshot, and then they pulled over and found a bullet hole in their camper. And so they report this to the authorities. The authorities kind of converge on the area where they think the shot came from, and they're looking around. They don't see anything yet, but then they hear a cough. One of the searchers turns around, and he sees Richard Matt lying on the ground with a shotgun pointed right at him. And so this searcher, who I believe was a Border Patrol agent, something like that, he doesn't waste any time defending himself and his colleagues. He opens fire, and he hits Matt in the head, and he kills him. And so this marked the end of Richard Matt's escape. The booze did him in, being out of shape did him in. He didn't make it. And so this is obviously a major break in the case, but the authorities, the governor, everyone is still very confused because where's David Sweat? He's nowhere to be found. The two men should have been together, right? But they weren't. They knew he must have been close. And so they ramp up the search even more. At this point, all resources converge on the Malone, New York area. And then 2 days later, on June 28th, David Sweat decides to make a very bold move. At this point, he was actually a little bit north of Malone, New York. He was hiding out in a little town called Constable, actually hiding out in a deer stand that he had found. He was only moving at night at this point to try to kind of evade capture, but he had been seeing a lot of signs of the searchers. At one point, he had even been up in the tree stand and watched a searcher walk right by the tree down below without noticing him. He's really feeling the pressure. He's really feeling the heat. And so on June 28th, David Sweat decides that he can't wait any longer. He needs to make a run for it, and he just can't do it at night. He needs to just go for it right now. And so he starts to move north just as he had been doing, and he makes it to this field in Constable, New York. And at the very same time that he emerges into this field, a New York State trooper named Jay Cook just so happened to be driving by on this rural road that kind of butts up against the field. And Jay Cook sees this man standing in the field. He's wearing camouflage. His initial thought is that it's actually another searcher, and he looks kind of confused and kind of lost. And so Jay Cook parks his car and actually yells out to this person to try and figure out what they're doing and maybe to help them. However, when he yells out, asking if he needs any help, the man just kind of waves him off. Like, nah, I'm fine. Just, leave me alone or whatever. And it's at this moment that Jay Cook realizes that's David Sweat. That's the guy we've been looking for. That's him right there. David Sweat takes off running at this point. Again, he's in a field. If he can make it to the tree line, then he probably is at least going to stand a chance of getting away. Of course, Jay Cook knows this as well. And so when David Sweat starts running, he pursues him. He follows him, and he's yelling out to him, telling him, if you don't stop, I'm going to shoot you. I have no choice. This predictably did not dissuade David Sweat. And so eventually, Jay Cook stops. He pulls out his gun and he starts firing at David Sweat. He takes 2 shots. He hits both of them, and David Sweat falls to the ground just before the tree line. Jay Cook runs up to him. He handcuffs him. Backup arrives. And it's at this moment that the true gravity of what had just happened sinks in, because the police realize that David Sweat, from the location he was shot and handcuffed, David Sweat was only a 1.5 miles from the Canadian border. That close to that line of freedom that he had been seeking for so long. Now, Sweat did not die, unlike Richard Matt. Sweat survived. Of course, he was seriously injured. He was brought to the hospital, and he started to tell his story. He was very proud. Despite the fact that he had been captured, he was very, very proud. Now, on June 6th, 2015, which again was the day that the prisoners emerged from that manhole and escaped, I myself was on a backpacking trip, a through hike actually, of the Northville Placid Trail in the Adirondacks, which is very insane because out of all of the trails in the United States that I could have been on, I just so happened to be on the very trail in the very same mountains at the very same time that these 2 killers escaped and were now on the loose end. But of course, when this happened, I was hiking through the wilderness, so I had no idea at first. I had no way of knowing about this breaking story that was unfolding just a little bit north of my location on the trail at the time. But then, on day 7 of this hike, I finally got a tiny little bit of cell service, and when this happened, I got a text message from my mom. Now, this text message shook me to my core. This is what it read. Warning, 2 extremely dangerous criminals escaped from prison today in upstate New York. 2 white men. We will send you pictures. Dad wanted me to alert you. Be safe. Folks, that is about the last thing that you want to read when you're in the middle of the woods just before the sun was setting, just before dark. That's when I got the text. Now, I didn't have a data plan on my cell phone back then, and so, I couldn't just Google what was happening. I had to rely on my mom to text me back and to give me more details about what was happening, mostly where the prison was that this break occurred from. Because again, in her text message, she had written, the escape happened from a prison in upstate New York. And for those of you that don't know, upstate New York refers to any part of the state that's not New York City. And so if this escape had happened in Buffalo, for instance, I wouldn't have cared at all. It wouldn't have made me nervous. That was hours and hours away. That's not my area. But my friend that I was hiking with happened to know that there was a maximum security prison called Dannemora that was located very close to where we were hiking at the time. And so I'm waiting and waiting for my mom to respond to tell me where the actual prison was. And I'm just getting more and more anxious with each passing moment. And I was just praying that she wasn't going to tell me that the escape had happened from Dannemora. But sure enough, as you all know at this point, she did eventually get back to me and confirmed my worst fear in that moment. And so the very next morning, we got the hell off this trail for good. We quit because we didn't know what direction these killers had been traveling in. Now, in hindsight, as I'm sure a number of you are going to point out in the comments, I was definitely being overly paranoid because the 2 men didn't even end up traveling in my direction. They were traveling north. We were a little bit south of the prison, so we could have continued. We would have been fine. Even if they were going in our direction, the chance that they were going to see us is obviously tiny. And I'm a little bit embarrassed about how much I freaked out about this at the time. Because as soon as I heard about this escape, I was like, I want to be off this trail. I freaked out. You can ask my friend. It's kind of embarrassing, but thankfully I did end up going back a few years later and successfully completed the Northville Placid Trail with no prison escapes this time. David Sweat would go on to get a few extra years tacked on to his life sentence for this escape. Joyce Mitchell would end up being sentenced to up to 7 years in prison for helping in the escape. She ended up getting released a little bit early on parole back in 2020. And this entire story revealed massive problems and corruption within the Clinton Correctional Facility. This is one of the most alarming and astonishing things about this story to me. This escape would not have been possible if prison staff had actually been following proper procedure. Now, Joyce Mitchell and Gene Palmer were the two prison workers who got the most blame, but there was also a lot of other workers that were doing all sorts of illegal and corrupt things, or negligent things. And this entire story just kind of blew all of this stuff wide open. And just to illustrate to you how bad things were in this prison, here's a direct quote from an official New York State report on this prison break. Quote, "In the time Sweat was out of his cell over a 3-month period, while he was breaking out and searching and stuff, a total of more than 400 counts should have been conducted. If only one of the counts was done properly, the escape plan would have been instantly stopped." Folks, thank you so much for watching. I have the best audience on YouTube. I appreciate all of you so much, and I'll see you in the next video. YouTube seems to think that you'll enjoy watching this video next, and so give it a click right now and enjoy.